to kick off and there we go. Welcome everybody. Welcome folks who have joined us here at the Cloquet Forestry Center and at a number of other broadcast sites around the state. This is Eli Sagor with the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative here at the Cloquet Forestry Center. And I'm very pleased to kick off the, I guess, 9th in our series of webinars. And there we go. Welcome everybody. Welcome folks who have joined us here at the Cloquet Forestry Center and at a number of other broadcast sites around the state. This is Eli Sagor with the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative here at the Cloquet Forestry Center. And I'm very pleased to kick off the, I guess, 9th in our series of webinars this year. Today we've got Linda Nagel. She's a professor in the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota and the director of the Cloquet Forestry Center, talking about resilience in the Minnesota Northwoods, adaptive silviculture for climate change. Linda's got lots of content, lots of good stuff to share with us, and is going to get into it in just a moment. I would remind you, as always, to please use the chat pod to let me know if you have any problems hearing or any technical issues. We'll do our best to respond to those, but I hope most of those have been resolved already during the sound check. But that chat pod is there, and Linda will pause 2 or 3 times during the presentation to take your questions. I will be fielding those questions, so it's really nice for me if I have those questions available in advance. So don't feel that you need to wait for her to pause. Please type those questions in anytime, and even if you don't see them appear in the chat pod, we will receive them. So I'm going to change your view here, and Linda, you're on.
Great, thank you very much, Eli, and welcome everybody to the webinar. I'd like to first acknowledge some of my collaborators who are integral to a number of pieces of the presentation that I'll give today. And I've given this presentation or variations of this presentation at a couple of different meetings and a number of different webinars, not through SFEC necessarily, so some of you may have seen some of this content before. But this is really a collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science that's based out of Houghton, Michigan. And I'm going to talk about some really broad basic concepts as well as a current research project that's of a pretty broad and large scale that we're putting in on the Chippewa National Forest here in Minnesota. Okay, so when I think about adaptive management, it's a really broad concept, and sometimes it's really useful to go back and look up some of this terminology just to see, well, what do the tomes say? What does the Dictionary of Forestry say, or what does any dictionary say about a particular term? And so the first term that I think is relevant to this particular topic is adaptive management. And this is the Dictionary of Forestry definition, a dynamic approach to forest management in which the effects of treatments and decisions are continually monitored and used, along with research results, so that's an important piece, to modify management on a continuing basis to ensure that objectives are being met. So it's really an iterative process of adjustment to make sure objectives are being met based on the information that we have available. If you do a Google search and you look at what images show up for adaptive management, these are the first 18 or so images. And it's not important that we look at what each image shows, but it is kind of an interesting thing to observe that these are all flowchart diagrams and they're all very similar in how they function. And so incorporating adaptive management into our silviculture is really a process that has been practiced and has been out there for a long time. So then what is resilience? So resilience is part of the title of this webinar. And how do we operationalize it? So how do we incorporate that into our decision making and what happens on the ground? So as I think about resiliency, that's often linked to the concept of a healthy forest. So I looked up healthy forest and thought this would be an interesting term to see what the dictionary had to say. And here it defines it as a perceived condition of a forest that's derived from concerns about such factors as age, structure, composition, function, vigor, presence of unusual levels of insects and disease, and resilience to disturbance. And this note at the bottom there basically tells us that our concept of a healthy forest is very much tempered and affected by our viewpoints and our interpretations and our perceptions. And so this concept is very vague, or this term is very vague as defined by the dictionary. So then let's define resistance and let's define resilience, because those two terms we sometimes use interchangeably and they can mean different things to different people. There's a definition of resilience that we often pull out of an old publication by Halling, 1973, and most current definitions of resilience are based out of this particular definition or this particular paper. Resistance is the capacity of the ecosystem to absorb disturbances and remain largely unchanged. A recent paper took this and applied it to how we think as silviculturists in terms of structure and function, and they define resistance as the influence of structure and composition on disturbance severity. If we contrast this to resilience, this concept here is the capacity of an ecosystem to return to some preconditioned state following a disturbance. So there's some change allowed, but it basically responds and falls back into that pre-disturbance condition. And this recent paper defined this as the influence of disturbance on subsequent structure and composition. Okay, and I'm going to compare and contrast those two approaches throughout the webinar today. Okay, so let's take a moment and we'll define what a disturbance is. The textbook definition here is any relatively discrete event over time that basically disrupts the growing space or disrupts the entities that are available to plants to grow. And as you can see from this diagram here, there's a relationship between the frequency and the severity of disturbances. Things like volcanic eruptions or meteor strikes on the Earth's surface are very rare occurrences, but they're very severe in terms of their impact. And we can contrast that down to single tree blowdowns and perhaps annual fires, ecosystems that experience annual fires, where the frequency is much higher, but the severity might be much less. So there's a gradient there. This diagram here shows the relationship or the distinction between ecosystems that are resistant versus resilient. So I'm going to give you two examples. So for the blue line, the resistant line, let's consider fire in two different ecosystem types. Let's consider fire in a coastal redwood forest. Redwoods have very thick bark, and so they're very resistant to fire. They can grow to be 1,000 years old. And so that blue line represents, we've got two disturbances on this graph, represents how that particular forest type will respond to fire. The dotted red line is a resilient forest, and let's consider aspen and its response to fire. So with aspen, a fire can come in, wipe out the overstory. Aspen has the ability to root sprout, and so it can regenerate and recover after a fire fairly quickly. So both of those forest types have the ability to maintain their cover over time, over long periods of time, but the way they do that is very different. The redwood forest is very resistant to fire, and the aspen forest is very resilient to fire. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about climate change. I put this graph in here for two reasons, just to kind of show different trends in temperature over time, and that the overall trends are that the Earth's surface temperatures are increasing, and to also remind us that there's a lot of variability across the globe in how climate is changing. I like to look at NOAA's webpage, and they summarize on a monthly basis anomalies in weather. And this one is from March of 2014, and of course the big story in Minnesota this past winter was how cold it was and for how long that cold persisted, and the variations in the polar vortex. And there's now evidence that's showing that the warming of the oceans is linked to how the polar vortex was shifted and affected our climate over the past winter. If we look at the most recent summary on NOAA's webpage, we can see This is for July of 2014, and the big news here is in the western United States, California in particular, that is currently experiencing extreme drought. And there are fires popping up all over California right now, and this has been a really big fire year for the states of Oregon and Washington, also linked to extreme drought conditions. So let's talk a little bit about the state of Minnesota. And this isn't necessarily a climate change talk, but I want to give you some context to understand some of the forestry concepts that I'll cover in a little bit. So this diagram here shows the main biome types that we have in the state of Minnesota, and this is a really interesting place to live and work because we have the juncture of three distinct biome types. We have the Laurentian mixed forest, the eastern broadleaf forest, and the prairie parklands. And if we think about climate change, what they're projecting in the year 2095, we've got Minnesota, the current conditions there in tan, and the conditions in the summertime are projected to be similar to the state of Kansas. And the conditions in the wintertime are projected to be similar to southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois. And so that kind of gives us a little bit of a flavor of what type of climate we might expect to see in 80 to 90 years. So some of the research that people are doing with this in mind is suggesting that this will have a significant impact on the biome types that we see across the state of Minnesota. Because we have all these ecotones between ecosystem types, those are places of natural change, and climate change might push those even further. This is a fairly recent diagram from the U.S. Drought Monitor that shows the droughts in the western United States, but also I pulled out the state of Minnesota, and we can see if you looked at this over the course of the year, it's actually been fairly mild for the state of Minnesota. There hasn't been a terrible amount of drought for us. However, Minnesota has experienced some significant weather events. Just a couple of days ago, there was frost reported in the south west part of the state with potential damage to crops, to soybeans and corn. And we can see the two pictures here. We've got the Duluth flood of 2012 that just down the road from here wiped out a swinging bridge at a state park and did a lot of damage to that particular park. The Pagami Creek fire in 2011 was a very, very large fire, 93,000 acres. And so we do see these extreme weather events popping up all around us. And a big story over the winter was the question of how the cold weather was going to affect things like emerald ash borer. Was that going to be affected in a positive way in terms of forest health? These are some photos just sort of bring us back to the start of last winter. In the Black Hills in South Dakota, they received a couple feet of snow in early October. They received their first snow already this year, about 4 inches or so across much of the Black Hills last week. So again, some extreme weather events. And some other forest impacts of climate change include things like the potential for expanded pest and disease ranges. These are pictures of mountain pine beetle in the western United States affecting primarily lodgepole pine. And one reason why we're concerned about that in the state of Minnesota is because lodgepole pine and jack pine overlap in their ranges in Canada, and there is this potential for mountain pine beetle to start affecting jack pine up in that particular region. This diagram shows the impact of emerald ash borer in an urban setting. Of course, we're very concerned about the impact of emerald ash borer across primarily black ash swamp forests here in the state of Minnesota. This is a picture of a savanna, an oak savanna ecosystem type in the lower peninsula of Michigan, and it's the primary habitat for wild lupin, which is the primary habitat for the Carner blue butterfly, which is an endangered species. And this particular butterfly has seen tremendous decreases in populations. It's no longer present in the state of Minnesota. The population in Wisconsin has been severely declining over the past couple of years, and there are some populations across the Northeast, but not very many. The primary habitat for this species is now in the lower peninsula of Michigan, and it is very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So there's a very concerted effort in this area to restore this habitat in order to not lose this particular species. But climate change could potentially have a positive impact on species like the Karner blue from the perspective of increasing the number of life cycles that it can complete in a given year. However, that coupled with the impacts of climate change on the vegetation or the habitat may not be enough to make this species viable in the future. Increased frequency and intensity of wildfire. This is a known potential secondary effect of climate change. In some pictures of the region here where we've seen some large fires coupled with drought events. This diagram shows plant hardiness zones from 1990 to 2006, and you can see in the state of Minnesota how those hardiness zones have changed over a relatively short period of time. And there are several models out there that help us understand the potential impacts of climate change on potential habitat of various forest species and forest types. One of the main tools that we use in the eastern United States is called the Tree Atlas. This is a tool developed by the U.S. Forest Service. And on the left-hand side of this diagram, we have current forest types. And on the right-hand side of the diagram, we have the potential habitat of various forest types in approximately 90 to 100 years under one of the worst-case scenarios of climate change. And so what we see in today's forest is a fairly diverse set of forests. We have a lot of aspen, birch, some spruce fir, and oak hickory, where we've got that deciduous forest in the middle of the state. If we look under climate change then, what happens is the projected habitat is much reduced. And you can see that the aspen birch is not very present, nor is that boreal forest. And so this isn't necessarily what's going to happen, but this tells us what could potentially happen based on models that help us predict potential habitat. And my point in showing you this diagram is not to go through the complicated flowchart, but rather to make the point that these are very complex interactions. These potential impacts of climate change are very interactive, and things like drought and wildfire and forest health issues are very much interrelated, and all things are connected. And so as we contemplate climate change and the impacts of climate change on forest ecosystems, it's really important to recognize how all of these things are connected. So now might be a good time to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions or any problems with people hearing.
Yeah, it seems like things are going okay with the audio, and your timing is very good. We just did get one question. Can you define the term volcanism that appeared, I think, on the previous slide?
Yep, great. Volcanism is simply the number of life cycles that an insect can complete in a given year. So as we think about climate change and how largely how minimum temperatures are increasing, there's the potential for certain organisms like the Karner blue butterfly and the mountain pine beetle to complete more than one life cycle, or increase the number of life cycles they can complete in a given year, which can have implications on the expanse of an organism such as mountain pine beetle, or the potential success of species like Karner blue butterfly in terms of reproduction and success.
Great, thanks, Linda. I don't see any other questions right now. I did notice that a moment ago somebody raised their hand, which is nice, and I would call on you if I could, but I can't, the way we've got the system set up. So a reminder that if you do have questions, please type them anytime into the chat pod. And I didn't say this before, but any of you here in Cloquet or at the other sites, if you have actually Cloquet folks, you can go ahead and shout them out if you do, or feel free to pass me a note with your question on it. Any questions here locally? Okay, just let me know if there are. And seeing no other questions right now, Linda, why don't you continue?
Great. Okay, so that's a little bit of a summary of climate change and potential impacts on forest ecosystems. But then that begs the question, what can forest planners and managers do about it? What can we do about climate change in our everyday activities? This diagram here is a mock-up of the silviculture prescription writing process, which most foresters go through when they are identifying forest management activities to meet objectives. And I'll walk through this very, very quickly. This is really driven by what a landowner objectives might be. When we develop silvicultural prescriptions, we need to collect a lot of information about the stand. We might collect inventory data, and we also will do a diagnosis of the stand. So do we have forest health issues or other concerns that we have that might surround that particular stand? Before we develop a prescription or an action, a management action, we need to have in mind what it is we want that future stand to look like. So we develop silvicultural prescriptions in response to where a stand is right now compared to where we want it to be into the future. And we call that a desired future condition. So we're managing for that desired future condition. We develop the prescription, we implement, we monitor, and if necessary, we may follow up. I want to focus a little bit of attention on the desired future condition portion of this process because it's highly relevant in the context of climate change. So we'll step back and define what a desired future condition is. It's the description of the land or resource conditions that are believed necessary if goals and objectives are fully achieved. So let's walk through some examples. This is a busy slide, but I'll walk through each one of them. So on the upper left-hand corner, that's a picture of a ponderosa pine stand. So it's a shelter wood system. It has an overstory with some regeneration underneath. And in many places in the western United States, a desired future condition has often been defined by a prior condition, say before significant European settlement in an area. And in this case, if we follow that desired future condition arrow to the right, we have a park-like stand of 350 to 500-year-old ponderosa pine that's maintained by repeated fire. So that might be a desired future condition. In the middle picture on the left-hand side, we have a red pine plantation. And let's say that that red pine plantation is on a site that is actually suited to another species, such as a northern hardwood site. And so our desired future condition might be to restore back to a condition that is more suited to that particular site. Let's say in the bottom left-hand corner we have a northern hardwood stand on site, and our objective, our desired future condition, is to keep that northern hardwood stand. So that could represent a desired future condition. Or perhaps maybe we want to incorporate an underrepresented species, as we see in the lower right-hand corner. That picture is eastern hemlock. And here we're just on the edge of eastern hemlock, but if we were to move to the east into Wisconsin and Michigan, eastern hemlock is a much greater component of the northern hardwood forest, and so that might be an appropriate desired future condition for that particular forest type. So the land manager and the landowner define their objectives, and they define what their desired future conditions are. But let's talk about this concept in the context of climate change. So in the upper left-hand corner here, we have another example of a ponderosa pine forest, and this is an even-aged stand. So these trees are all the same age. They might be 80 years old along this hillside. And in this example, the desired future condition is an old multi-age stand. Okay, so we've got lots of large trees, we have some medium-sized trees, and we have some regeneration. What we don't know exactly is how climate change is going to affect the natural stand dynamics of that ponderosa pine stand that's even aged. We don't know exactly in what direction climate change will push that stand. But what we do know is that if we maintain that desired future condition of that old multi-strata stand, that it will require an increasing amount of resources, both in effort and in terms of money, to maintain that desired future condition. So in other words, if we continue managing toward that old multi-age structure, and that's not the direction climate change is going to push that stand naturally, it will require an increasing amount of resources to meet that objective. But rather, if we were to think about a future condition, managing for a future condition informed by what we know about climate change, that's what we would call adaptive management. So if we were to frame a forest condition as a desired future condition that is informed by climate change, it will require fewer resources and it will create a stand that is more resilient and able to withstand disturbances into the future than if we simply manage the way we've always managed or the way we've been thinking about desired future conditions outside the context of climate change. So one thing that management will have to do is work within this uncertainty. So how do we manage to meet these objectives knowing that we don't necessarily know everything we need to know at this time? So there's been a fair bit of work and a fair number of publications that have come out that are suggesting that to accommodate this change into the future, one of the guiding principles is that we need to manage our forest structures for greater diversity and structural complexity, and that these concepts will be key to maintaining ecosystem function. And here's a whole list of ways that we can do that. We can incorporate diversity and complexity into our forest management. And I'm not going to walk through all of these, but they really are related to understanding your ecosystem types, understanding how species respond to disturbances, and trying to manage for species that are expected to do better under a changing climate. This also means thinking about various temporal and spatial scales. So maintaining biodiversity across composition, structure, and function, across the genetic to species to community levels, and also across a stand to landscape to bioregional levels. So as always, it's important to think about the land that you're managing in a much broader context. So let's talk about, we're going to compare and contrast a couple of different silvicultural approaches and how we might think about these concepts. So this is a graph that shows time on the x-axis and ecosystem characteristics on the y-axis. And those ecosystem characteristics could be anything from biodiversity to volume to tree biomass, various habitat characteristics, stand structure in general, could be coarse woody debris. And let's say we have a stand that starts way over on the left, and the B represents if we were managing for an intensive, even-aged, single-species plantation. So in this case, where the B is, that represents our desired future condition, and that's a fairly narrow window, and we can see that the ecosystem characteristics is relatively low. So that means we have relatively low resilience in that stand, and we have relatively low adaptive capacity of that particular stand because that desired future condition window is so narrow. But let's say we're going to manage that stand with single tree selection. So this is an uneven-aged approach to management. Here we might have a higher level of structural complexity in the stand. We may have more species diversity in the stand. So the resilience of that stand might be higher, but that circle with the A in it represents the desired future condition, and that's still relatively narrow. If we're managing a traditional uneven-aged system, it's a pretty narrow window of desired future condition that we're managing for. So the adaptive capacity there is still relatively low. But if we managed forests for greater complexity overall, what that means is as the stand progresses over time, there's much more chance to change the direction of that stand development pattern if we have built in that complexity from the very beginning. And so the adaptive capacity of managing for complexity is much higher. And this gives us a lot more options as we move forward if we compare that approach to managing for plantations. And so this is a really complex concept, but the idea here is to think about the different ways that we manage forests and how we might build in that adaptive capacity as we move forward. When we think about managing for climate change, there's kind of two sides of a coin that pop up. We talk about mitigation and we talk about adaptation. And oftentimes these are complementary approaches, and sometimes they're different. With mitigation, we're really talking about how do we mitigate the effects of climate change, how do we sequester more carbon into our forests based on how we manage those forests, how do we conserve carbon stocks, how do we protect forests from fire and insects and disease. And the adaptation side of that coin, we're talking about how to build in more adaptive capacity into our forests, and also how to strengthen the communities that surround how forests are managed and natural resources are managed. And what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this talk primarily is that adaptation side of this coin, realizing that some of those strategies are also complementary to the mitigation side. So let's define these a little bit. Adaptation are actions that are moderating the vulnerability of forests to climate change. They're positioning forests to be more productive and healthier into the future, more resilient and resistant, and they're facilitating ecosystem responses to change. Whereas mitigation, again, is using forests to sequester carbon in forms like renewable energy from biomass, avoiding carbon losses from fire, mortality, conversion, etc. Okay, so we're going to revisit these terms that I covered at the very beginning of the webinar. So resistance, this is again, these are kind of based in some older literature and they've been modified as we move forward thinking about them in the context of climate change. Resistance are actions that improve the defenses against anticipated change or directly defend the forest against disturbance in order to maintain relatively unchanged conditions. So that piece is really important, relatively unchanged conditions. Typically, this approach might be appropriate for short-term or high-value forests. And this is in contrast to resilience. Resistance is often thought of as paddling upstream, and it's not a sustainable way of managing forest resources. Resilience, on the other hand, are actions that accommodate some degree of change, but encouraging a return to a prior condition following a disturbance. Here, some examples are thinning to improve health and vigor, or managing vegetation following a disturbance. And then another term I'm going to throw out here because it's relevant to the project I'll describe here in a few minutes is transition. And this is also sometimes called response. But the idea here is that we are developing actions that are intentionally to accommodate change and enable ecosystems to adapt and respond to new and changing conditions into the future. So examples here might be assisting migration of species or range shifts or increasing connectivity of migration corridors. And we'll talk about these in greater detail here in a couple of minutes. Just a comment about assisted migration. So there's varying degrees of how we might incorporate this into our management. So in this panel, the far left represents an assisted population migration where you might be moving a species within its known range. Okay, and the middle one represents a condition where we might be trying to hedge our bets with what we anticipate climate to be in the future, where we are moving a species just outside of its current geographic range. And the panel on the right, labeled C, is an example of moving a species far outside its current range. And this example on the far right represents a lot of financial responsibility and ecological risk because for various reasons, but one is that we don't know how that species might perform given it's unprecedented in that particular area. And so this is a concept that needs a great deal of consideration and a great deal of thinking as to what might be appropriate for a given forest type and a given landowner, and realizing that all of those approaches come with some level of risk. Okay, so we defined resistance, resilience, and transition, and this graphic shows these three approaches to management kind of along a spectrum. So resistance, again, you're trying to manage for what you currently have. So you're reducing climate change impacts and maintaining your current condition. If we move all the way to the transition treatment, or the transition concept, here we're promoting change and we're trying to facilitate adaptive responses. So we can think about these treatments or these approaches as overlapping boxes. They're certainly not necessarily distinct. And as you start getting into the weeds and thinking about, well, if I'm managing an aspen stand, at what point do you transition from a resistance to a resilience treatment? And that's not always crystal clear. So keep that in mind that we're working along a spectrum of treatments. Okay, now might be another good time to pause and see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Linda. I don't see any questions in our chat pod. I wonder if folks are have any out there now that they're going to type in. If so, go ahead and type them. Any questions here locally? Let's pause for just a moment and see if any come in, but it doesn't look to me like anyone's typing. Remember, folks, you can type those questions in any time. I'll kind of save them up and forward them to Linda during her pauses. We're now about 36 minutes in. But don't see any more questions coming in. So Linda, go ahead.
All right, well, I fear that everybody's fallen asleep. We can't see. I can only see a small section of the crowd. Okay, well, what I want to do next is transition into talking about a very large-scale project that I'm a collaborator on with a number of people from primarily the U.S. Forest Service. And it's a multi-region, long-term silviculture study. And this project came about several years ago when I'm involved in a lot of professional training programs, and there was an interest in expanding what we're teaching about climate change, and also a recognition that all these concepts are really great, but what we really need are some on-the-ground examples of how managers would implement climate change strategies into on-the-ground practices. And so I was awarded a grant to establish some examples of these treatments at various locations across the country. And right now we've got 2 sites that are established. And the first site that we've established this project on is on the Chippewa National Forest. And so I'll step back and tell you what the overall project goals are for this study. The first one is to introduce natural resource managers to tools and approaches that can help them integrate climate change into their decision-making practices. And the way that we're accomplishing this goal is to conduct 2 to 3 day long workshops that teach people some of the tools that I'm going to go over here in a few minutes. The second goal then is to populate this multi-region study with ecosystem-specific climate change adaptation treatments by using a panel that consists of scientists, that consists of foresters and managers of that area. And so the idea is that these treatments that are designed as part of this study really represent logical, on-the-ground, well-informed approaches to management. And the robustness of the study will be in the fact that we've got these replicated at various locations, and we can not only learn from each location, but perhaps across different sites to see how different forest types respond. So this map represents the people who are involved in this particular project. I started this project when I was at Michigan Tech, and then now at the Cloquet Forestry Center, it actually positions me a little closer to where our first site is, which is on the Chippewa National Forest. And so we developed a team of scientists, and we worked with them for about 1.5 years to help design what this study would look like, and to also define a lot of terms that we are using across all of these sites. And it really opened up a lot of questions as we developed this study, because the terms that I just went through, which might seem straightforward and easy, when you take them and apply them to different areas, become very complex. And so as I mentioned, the Chippewa National Forest and the Cutfoot Experimental Forest is the first site. The San Juan National Forest in southwest Colorado is our second site, which we've done the workshop and have treatment areas defined with some pre-treatment data collection already occurring there. And then our third site is expected to be the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas, and then we still have yet to develop a couple of more sites across the country. So I want to talk specifically about the Chippewa site, as it's very relevant to managing Minnesota forests for resiliency. And the key partners here are Brian Palick and Crystal Kern from the Northern Research Station, and Tony D'Amato from the University of Minnesota, as well as some other Northern Research Station staff and Chippewa National Forest staff. This is a really large-scale project that's occurring across about 500 acres. So it's in terms of silviculture studies, that's quite large. And I'll go through kind of where we're at with this particular study at this point, because this particular site has moved along very quickly. Okay, so the basic process that we're using, remember the first slide or the second slide that I showed you had all these diagrams of adaptive management cycles? Well, this looks very similar to that. This is from the Forest Adaptation Resources book that was a GTR that was published by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and in it, it has kind of this modified adaptive management process. It also looks very similar to the silviculture prescription writing process. So the first step here is to define an area of interest, what your management goals and objectives are, and your time frames. The second step is to assess your climate change impacts and vulnerabilities for that area of interest. And I'll go through where we found this information. The third step is to evaluate your management objectives given projected impacts and vulnerabilities. And this is the step where we might ask ourselves about those desired future conditions and whether or not they're appropriate given what we know about climate change impacts. The fourth step is to identify adaptation approaches and tactics for implementation. And then the fifth step, of course, is to monitor and follow up. Okay, so what we did on the Chippewa National Forest in June of 2013 is we had designed a workshop that we delivered to a group of folks on the forest to teach them these tools and practices and approaches to climate change adaptation. And this is a really interactive type of workshop, and so that was on the first day, and then the second and third days were designed to involve the scientists and a few key partners from that forest to design the actual experiment. So we spent some time inside listening to presentations and doing a lot of work. It truly was a workshop. We went out in the field and visited the site where we wanted to put in this experiment, and then we came back and we hammered out basically all the elements of a silvicultural prescription to accommodate those different treatments that we wanted to implement. Okay, so we gathered a lot of information. The NIAX group out of Houghton has been working with a number of national forests in the region, most of them, in fact, and they've pulled together a lot of information about climate change vulnerabilities and are producing these vulnerability assessments. And this picture on the right shows a new document, hot off the press, in 2014 for the state of Minnesota. And it's an incredibly useful document that summarizes climate change impacts and vulnerabilities for the state of Minnesota. And I would recommend it to anybody to understand how climate change is going to impact forests in this state. So a description of the particular area where we're doing this study, it's an FDN 33, so it's a northern dry music mixed woodland. The basal area is about 180 square feet per acre. It's just shy of about 100 years old. It's single to multi-cohort. The overstory is dominated by red pine with some white and jack pine and some other species including paper birch, northern red oak, red maple, white spruce, and aspen. And its current condition is considered to be vulnerable to several forest health issues. So another piece of information that we looked at were some model outputs. We used a couple of different models. We used Landis 2 as well as the Tree Atlas. And these tables here summarize the Tree Atlas output. So what we have are species here that are currently existing on the Chippewa National Forest, their current importance value, so the higher the number, the more that species is present. And then the Hadley high difference there represents the projected potential habitat for that species into the future under various climate change scenarios. So for instance, quaking aspen is it's the most common species across that forest, and this -17 represents that it's expected to see a significant decline in its potential habitat in the future. This table here represents the increased habitat suitability for a number of species. So bur oak, for instance, has a current importance value of 2.95, and The Hadley high difference is 2.67, so it's not increasing, but it's being maintained on that particular site. Green ash, we might question whether that's a species we would want to promote, given what we know about emerald ash borer, red maple, and eastern white pine. So we use this information as we design the silvicultural treatments. So what we wanted to do is design an experiment that showed a gradient of approaches for climate change. So the resilience treatment might represent business as usual. The resilience treatment might represent changes to how we might typically manage that forest type, and the transition treatment might represent something that is quite risky to a land manager, but allows us to see how forest types might change under climate change, or might still address our desired future conditions under various climate change scenarios. So we had a whole suite of treatments that we wanted to incorporate into this study. So I'll just walk you through briefly what those prescriptions look like across the treatment. So we do have a no action treatment, and these treatments are being replicated 4 times at that site, and each treatment is about 20 to 25 acres in size. And so we have, actually this study we're replicating them 5 times, so we have 5 areas with no treatment, and this allows us to have a baseline to compare all of the other treatments. So here we're allowing the forest to respond to climate change. Our DFC is to maintain current conditions, our objective, maintain current conditions, and our tactic, no harvest. So that's pretty simple, and the point here is to provide a baseline. The resistance treatment, and all I'm going to cover here is the species composition goal. We have goals for forest health and forest productivity as well, but this one is the easiest one to think about. So our management goal here is to maintain a relatively unchanged condition over time. So it's red pine dominated, so our desired future condition is a red pine dominated single cohort stand with some minor species present. Our objective here is to maintain red pine at about 90% of the total stocking, with minor species at 10%. And then our prescription here is to do a thinning down to 100 to 120 square feet of basal area per acre, to remove primarily red and jack pine, to maintain species diversity, to protect regeneration, and to reserve large diameter trees. So this is a typical management style for a red pine forest of this nature. The resilience treatment, on the other hand, the goal here is to allow some change, but to encourage an eventual return to the reference condition. Our desired future condition here is to still maintain a red pine dominated stand with its abundance fluctuating over time. Minor species will increase compared to current conditions, and we want to increase heterogeneity and complexity. Our objectives: maintain red pine dominance, but at a lesser level than the resistance treatment, and to increase future adapted species over time. And here we've got a little bit more of a complex management approach. We're going to do a variable density thinning. There'll be some areas that are unthinned, and then there will be some gaps that will be put in, and we will disperse thin the matrix down to that standard of 100 to 120 square feet of basal area per acre, and then we will plant future adapted species in those gaps. Okay, then if we take the last treatment, the transition treatment, this is where it gets pretty interesting. Here our management goal is to intentionally accommodate change and enable ecosystems to adapt to a changing and new condition. We want to increase the abundance of future adapted species. We want to create a multi-cohort, non-pine dominated, high species diversity with structural complexity. So you can see that we've really changed what our DFC is here. We're going to reduce that red pine stocking to 25 to 50%, increase future adapted species. And our tactics, here we're going to put in more gaps, and we're calling this an irregular shelter wood, and we will thin that matrix area down to 60 to 80%, or 80 square feet per acre. We will do site prep just like the resilience treatment, and then we'll plant future adapted species both in gaps and in that matrix that we've thinned further. And then we have a plan for what will happen 10 to 15 years down the road. So how did we decide what species to plant in these different treatments? So here's the tables that I showed you earlier about reduced habitat suitability and increased habitat suitability from the tree atlas. And the species in green represent the species we chose for this particular study. So we wanted to do a whole suite of species to test how various species respond to these different silvicultural treatments under climate change. And I'll just go to the next slide, so I'll highlight how this works. So we also use the suitability of tree species by native plant community document that John Almendinger from the Minnesota DNR has put together that also incorporates some climate change information. And so if we were to just use the tree atlas, we would have come up with different species if we hadn't used local knowledge to help us define what we were going to do. So with the resistance treatment, here again we're promoting red pine dominance, so we're not planting any species. The resilience treatment, the species that we wanted to promote are eastern white pine, jack pine, red oak, bur oak, and red maple. So all of those species currently exist on that site, and looking at how they're projected to respond to climate change, those are ones that we felt were pretty safe in that particular treatment. The transition treatment, we decided to try some species that are on the edge or outside of the current range for those species. So here we've got eastern white pine, red oak, bur oak, and white oak, red maple, bitternut hickory, and black cherry. And because if you look at the projected species compositions, we run out of conifers to choose from. And so we decided that we will consider planting ponderosa pine, which is the next drought-tolerant conifer available that would potentially grow in this particular area. The other species that was actually projected to do really well is eastern red cedar, but it was very difficult to get people excited about planting eastern red cedar in northern Minnesota, so we dropped that species from the mix. This diagram just shows, again, all the treatment areas. So again, this is 500 acres on the Cutfoot Experimental Forest, and we've got pre-treatment data that's already been collected this summer. The treatments have been marked, and it is slated to be harvested this winter. And so this study is moving along very quickly, and so hopefully in the next year or two we'll have some example silvicultural treatments on the landscape that we can monitor over time and see how they respond. I'm not going to go through this whole table. This is just to show you that we have a whole suite of variables that we'll monitor and measure at each of these sites to assess how well they are meeting the management objectives set forth by the managers at each of those sites. And those fall under the categories primarily of species composition, forest health, and productivity. And that brings me to my summary slide, so you'll have a chance to ask some questions again after this. And this is pretty brief. So learning from the past is going to become increasingly important as we consider climate change in our management. The challenge here is that there are no historical precedents for climate change in the direction that our climate seems to be heading, and so there's a great deal for us to learn. Long-term research is also extremely important. Silvicultural research is very difficult to establish because it is long-term and it takes usually a great deal of land to replicate treatments, and so this is a wonderful opportunity for us to learn a great deal of things from this new study. We need to continue trying to understand the impacts of climate change on forests and recognize that we will be best served if we think about a range of conditions, so not managing necessarily for extremes that we think might happen under different climate change scenarios, but considering a range of those conditions. Management will need to work with uncertainty. We've always had uncertainty, but uncertainty is likely going to increase into the future. Managing for complexity very well might increase our resilience in northern forests, and that's the whole goal of this project, is to try to see where that sweet spot might be. And being creative and adaptive in our approaches in terms of developing solutions is our best approach, and that's a basic silvicultural concept that we all practice in our everyday management. So that's it. Thanks for your attention. Really appreciate it, and we'll take some final questions.
Great. We've got a bunch of questions here, Linda. First, from Susan, and a couple of these came in just after your last pause, so some of these relate to the ideas from your last section. Is soil content and rock base a factor in tree planting to start a more resilient forest?
Yeah, I guess the way I would answer that question is even as we consider climate change, climate isn't going to quickly affect anything like soils or the substrate. Certainly climate is affecting things like microbial activity and nutrient dynamics, but there are some basic principles of matching species to site that will continue to be important as we consider what species are most appropriate under different climate change scenarios. And those kinds of site factors are embedded in some of the climate change models, but what's not embedded are things like competition or seed dispersal or any of those types of dynamics.
Got it. Next question is about the assisted migration concept. And you closed that section by defining moving different populations versus long distances and so on. From Grand Rapids, what about moving white pine from North Carolina to Minnesota, for example? That seems like it would clearly fall into your third category, but do you want to elaborate on that at all?
Sure, yeah. I mean, some species have incredibly wide geographical ranges. White pine's an interesting species because even its silvical attributes can vary depending on where you are. So say in the state of Michigan or Wisconsin or Minnesota, it can be of a certain shade tolerance, and in the Northeast it might be of greater or lesser shade tolerance. So there's a lot of variability within a given species. So yeah, I guess that question is sort of raising issues over the definition in assisted migration, and that's going to vary from species to species. We would not consider planting a seed source from North Carolina in northern Minnesota, but we might consider planting a seed source that's more directly south of the state of Minnesota or more slightly to the east. So all of these principles are tempered by practical experience and specific situations and scenarios.
Great. Our next question, kind of on this idea of resistance, resilience, transition. What groups are promoting resistance on one end of the spectrum versus transition on the other?
So resistance treatments, as I alluded to in some of the slides, would be silvicultural approaches that maybe we currently practice. So if we're managing, say, red pine plantations, and we want to continue managing red pine plantations, but we know red pine will become increasingly vulnerable given our location, that would be managing for resistance. But if the species is projected to do okay or fare better in the future, that might be a resilience treatment. I don't know of that many people who are practicing transition treatments on an operational basis. That is more of an experimental concept. And I don't want people to take away from this talk that I'm necessarily promoting planting bitternut hickory in northern Minnesota widely. The luxury we have in designing this experiment is that it is an experimental forest. We can control a lot of the parameters surrounding what we're doing, and it allows us to test some of these concepts that may or may not work into the future. So that's a really good question. I don't know if I answered it very adequately, but to start.
Sounded good to me. If anyone who submitted a question feels that you'd like more elaboration or clarification, I'll watch for that. Go ahead and type it in. And I do want to mention, since we're at our time, some of you who have signed on, feel free to, if you plan to request continuing education credits, I have opened that form to accept responses. It'll remain open for about another half hour. But you will need to complete that form online in order to get credits. We are not able to give credits to folks who watch the recording but we do need you to fill that out now. Those of you at our broadcast site watching live, please be sure to sign in on paper. And we're going to keep going here. We have a few more questions lined up from Grand Rapids. Are you incorporating other considerations into the project? I assume the project in the chip, like non-timber forest products, for instance, blueberries, balsam boughs, and so on. What about wildlife considerations? How do those factor into your project?
Those are really great issues to consider. What we have with this particular study is the basic design being implemented with a limited amount of resources. And so what we've decided to do at this point is set a minimum number of things that we need to collect data on across all of these sites. And then we're hoping that people will be interested in these research sites and will see that the structure is basically there and they're open and available for people to add on additional questions. Particularly across the landscape in northern Minnesota, timber isn't the only resource that we are concerned about when we think about managing our natural resources. And although we don't have specific questions related to, say, blueberry production, we will be measuring understory vegetation response, and so hopefully we'll capture some of that data that would allow us to answer and address questions related to non-timber forest products.
Great. Next question, also from Grand Rapids. Is there interest in similar projects for more common Minnesota forest types like aspen or lowland conifers?
I would say yes. The structure of this project being so large and multi-site limits what we can do at the scale that we're doing it. But what I would encourage people to think about is those creative approaches that they might want to try. And there might be a way for us to establish those sites in something of a different sort of network where we can learn from them over time. And if we know about them, then we can perhaps collect some basic information and make some comparisons across sites.
Thank you. From St. Paul, will there be any promotion of natural regeneration?
Yeah, I didn't mention that. So I focused a lot on what species we're going to plant, but we're expecting there to be natural regeneration in at least the resilience and the transition treatments, because we're doing a significant amount of harvesting, opening up the canopy, and we'll be monitoring response of both natural regeneration as well as planted species. Great question.
Okay, and the last question that I see here is, we are wondering about the influence of the Great Lakes. Do you think that the islands will be influenced differently?
You mean, does the questioner mean the islands or pockets of the islands within the lake?
I'm going to assume that they're referring to islands like the Apostle Islands, large islands within the lake that might see moderated effects or different effects of changing climate because of the lake effect. But if I'm wrong, whoever asked that question can set us straight.
Great question, and I cannot speak authoritatively to that, but one would presume there would be a different effect, especially when we think about how frequently does Lake Superior freeze over versus not, and the variability we see from year to year. So certainly there's got to be some effect of that.
We got a big yup from Grand Rapids, so we apparently interpreted the question right. All right, we're a few minutes after our time. Those of you who have tuned in online, you'll see the continuing education form there. You might have to scroll up just a little bit in the chat pod. Others, again, be sure to sign in. I've also shared a link to a quick feedback form, and we always welcome your feedback, and I encourage you to just take a moment, tell us what you liked, what we could have done better, and so on. I have recorded this session. I'll send out a recording. We'll post it to our webinar page online, so if you have that link, you can look for the recording there, but we will also email it out to anyone who pre-registered. I want to thank Linda one more time for a great presentation, covering a lot of ground here on resistance, resilience, transition, adaptive silviculture, and related work here in Minnesota.